2020, a year that will no doubt go down in history as one of the most memorable and one that many actually want to forget. The arrival of the COVID-19 virus not only had an impact on the lives of the people that caught the virus, but has also torn a hole in the global economy, impacting aviation, the stock market, the leisure industry, and of course, the retail industry, which saw lockdowns really hit hard.
No restaurants, no hotels, no cafes and cinemas and things, no tourists. That's is going to have a huge impact on us this year, I'm sure. And other things is just really hoping things tick over and we can make our way through and we survive it all. I think that's the most important thing to us at the moment. We're not really looking beyond that.
Well, this year has also seen a shake-up in the corridors of the White House in the United States, with incumbent President Donald Trump suffering a landslide defeat against the President-elect Joe Biden. Yet in spite of the results, is something that Trump and his supporters refuse to accept, claiming monumental fraud.
This has a long way to go. This has a long way to go. You're going to find tremendous fraud. You're going to find fraud of hundreds of thousands of votes per state. You're going to find fraud of many, many times the votes that I need. Again, we're not talking about less votes where, 20 votes, but it doesn't turn the election. No, we're talking about thousands and thousands of votes beyond what we need to turn a state.
Hello and welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kabatahwai. In this episode, the final one of the year 2020, we're going to take a look back at some of the major stories that hit the front pages throughout the year and remind ourselves of just how difficult a year 2020 was. Joining me in the studio today in this end of the year special is Mahan Abedin and Atafe Padidar. Well, many thanks for both of you for being in this end of the year special.
You're welcome.
Mahan, first over to you, the main story that stood out for you for the year 2020.
Well, obviously the corona crisis, but beyond that, it's how disjointed the world is.
And for you?
I think the global market crash caused by this pandemic was one of the main events of 2020.
Everything surrounding COVID obviously has had this kind of impact. In terms of what has occurred, we're going to obviously look at COVID. Mahan and Atafe are going to be with us throughout the show as we look back on this year. First, let's take a look at our first recap, which no doubt was the biggest news of 2020. Of course, what we just talked about, the COVID-19 pandemic.
When reports started emerging from the district of Wuhan that a virus had started causing flu-like symptoms, breathing difficulties, and in some cases death, nobody really considered just what would happen next. On December the 19th, 2019, COVID-19 was named, and the consequences have caused over 1.7 million deaths and nearly 80 million infections worldwide. Yet it was not just the human impact that caused devastation. COVID-19 brought with it one of the most difficult years in recent history. Medical institutions soon found themselves overwhelmed with the significant increase in high-demand patients, all whilst facing PPE shortages and seeing that medical teams themselves were becoming infected with the virus. But it was the impact on the economy which brought a second layer of misery to many people, with multiple companies, businesses and trades all collapsing at a rate of knots rarely seen, with national GDPs slipping by as much as 25% in some nations. The aviation industry ground to a halt, with flights cancelled, jobs lost, routes wound down, all leading to many airlines either seeking huge multi-billion-dollar government bailouts or going bust altogether. With the promise of the vaccine just around the corner, what now remains to be seen is the recovery time to a return to normal. Yet with the mammoth logistical task of distributing the vaccine to over 7.8 billion people around the world, it may well be longer than we all wish for.
Time now to take a look back at one of our esteemed guests, YouTuber Dan Gause, also known as Nonstop Dan, and remind ourselves of what he said about the impact of the coronavirus on one of the worst hit industries.
So the impact on the aviation industry is obviously huge. We have never really seen anything happen like this before, and it's pretty crazy how fast things are changing. Because just a few weeks ago, I was flying Singapore Airlines, and I was talking to the crew about the situation, whether they were worried, what the airline was doing, and they said that we feel pretty confident about this. We managed SARS pretty well, so they felt like they kind of practiced and they knew what was coming. But just a few days later, the airline revealed massive cuts to their routes. And I think this is something we're seeing all across the industry. And airlines are not prepared for this. They had no idea the scale that this would reach. And we still don't really know how big the scale will be and how long it will last. So it's a scary time for airlines in many ways, and especially for the employees, not really knowing, now that many of them are being sent on involuntary leave, not knowing when or if they'll get to come back to their jobs.
Okay, obviously many layoffs there. Atafe, let me start with you here. As the report just showed that we just saw, what Dan Goss said there, there are a whole range of industries that have been affected because of this COVID-19, suffering the impact that has been so widespread. Of course, not to mention the devastating loss of lives because of it. Do you think that there's finally a light at the end of the tunnel that we're seeing right now, especially with the announcement of the vaccine? And how long will it take for things to return back to normal, you think?
Well, a vaccine is definitely a good news, but we have to understand that not every country has started the vaccination, and it will take months, perhaps a year, for everyone across the globe get vaccinated. And a lot of experts say that 2021, the winter of 2021 is going to be the time when things are finally going to move toward becoming normal. But I believe that we cannot call that normal. The life that we knew before this pandemic is over and things have changed. There's going to be a new normal after this pandemic.
Okay, Mahan, it seems that the vaccines that are being introduced are from at least two of the big pharmaceutical companies. What are the names here? Pfizer and AstraZeneca. Yeah. We're all too familiar with pharmaceutical companies. Of course, their main intention to cure people, but what's behind their intention? Do you think that the rollout of the vaccine is just another big money-making opportunity for these pharmaceuticals?
Yes, but that would be the obvious answer. That's what pharmaceutical companies do all the time. They want to make money, and no one can begrudge them for that. The same arguments were made during the AIDS issue all those years ago, that they're trying to make money at the expense of people, and other diseases and pandemics. I think the real issue here is the disparity in the people getting the vaccine, the rich-poor divide, or more specifically this time, the north-south divide. So you see the Western countries, led by the UK, have rushed into getting the vaccine done. The EU started today, the Americans a few days ago. They're going to have people vaccinated. Whereas in other countries in the world, vaccination is slow to start.
All right, let's now take a look at another huge story that rocked the year 2020, namely the economic and political issues affecting the US. From trade wars with China to racial inequality, they all had a massive impact on the U.S. economy and ultimately on Donald Trump.
As the world's largest economy, many would have speculated that 2020 would have been a good year for the US. After all, President Donald Trump has taken reasonable steps to build up the American economy from the inside out. Yet 2020 brought with it multiple events that would change the ideas of many. Naturally, the coronavirus played a huge part in the year, with millions of Americans infected by the virus. Having the highest death rate in the world also didn't help. And of course, the subsequent impact on the US economy, with furlough schemes and payouts all failing to truly hit the mark. Following this was a series of stock market crashes, oil price crashes, and various collapses in trade, all linked to the various events. Donald Trump also lost his ties with China following a bitter trade war, and yet, in spite of numerous efforts to plaster the cracks over, China and the US have become trade rivals, sparking off a host of bitter words by Trump towards China, including calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus. Trump's racist views soon became reflected at home. Following the brutal murder of George Floyd by police officers, Trump failed to take assertive action by condemning the act, sparking off the Black Lives Matter movement, which soon spread to a global phenomenon. It seems that Trump's failure to effectively deal with the COVID-19 crisis, as well as his poor handling of the BLM movement, it ultimately cost him his job, as Joe Biden swept to a landslide victory in the presidentials, something that Trump still finds a bitter pill to swallow.
Earlier in the year, we were joined by Professor Robert Elliott from the University of Birmingham, and he spoke about the ongoing trade war between China and the U.S. Let's remind ourselves of just what he said.
There's very little willingness on the part of the US to punish China at this stage due to concerns about the economic impact that any breakdown in relations would have on the global economy is already struggling due to the pandemic. So where are we? We're in an election year. Trump has still a lot to gain from being tough on China, but of course, with an economy in free fall, it's going to be very difficult. He's got a very difficult balancing act to perform at the moment.
Not much of an act anymore for him. I think he's going to be outgoing. Okay, let me start with you, Mahan.
Sure.
The big news this year was not only the economic impact of the virus, but also the failure of Donald Trump to not only contain it, but also seems like to win a second term in office. Do you think that Joe Biden can bring something new to the table, especially when it comes to China? Is it going to be a different approach than what Donald Trump had?
Well, he'll definitely have a softer tone. But however, in terms of the actual policies and the general US approach to China, I don't think so. Because the policies are obviously set by the institutions. And the key US institutions, the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, in addition to the whole kind of American apparatus, they're very Sinophobic right now for a good reason. China is catching up. Not only catching up, but by 2028 it's going to supersede the US as the world's leading economy.
Kept up with the news that just came out.
Yeah,
Very
absolutely.
good. Okay, Atif, to you. The Black Lives Matter movement, that was another big story, obviously, for this past year. Economic inequality, amongst other things, were highlighted by them. What legacy will Trump have left as a president that perhaps is negative, that many say led to the division of the U.S., that maybe Joe Biden needs to then pick up the pieces?
Well, definitely Trump divided America. That's his legacy. And I think for Biden, whatever he wants to do when he becomes the president, first things first, he has to bridge the gap between white Americans and not white Americans. He has to unite the United States once again.
Very well. Now, as we approach the end of the year, Europe will be also seeing a major economic shift, namely in the shape of Brexit. Let's take a look at the latest development there and look back at a year of extensions and frustrations for the Brexit negotiating teams.
In 2016, Britain went to the polls and voted to leave the European Union. The term Brexit was soon dubbed and became major news for the next 4 years. Following the vote, negotiations began to take place between the UK and the EU as to just how Britain would leave the bloc, with many people in the UK pushing for a so-called no-deal Brexit, believing that Britain did not need to deal with the EU and were quite capable of going it alone. However, the reality of a no deal soon set in, with businesses realising that without the EU trade benefits, things would get a lot tougher in Britain. Many multinational corporations, including major banks and European medicines agencies, downsized or left the UK altogether following the vote, putting thousands of jobs at risk and giving a taste of things to come. With the majority of Britain's food coming from the EU, supermarket shelves began to empty, prices began to increase, and concerns about the free movement of people and access to labour all played a part in a post-Brexit trauma. Recently, talks stalled and failed on multiple occasions as the end of the transition period came near, with Britain attempting to stand firm against the EU on fishing rights, fair competition and trade rules, with many EU figures vying to make an example of the UK to others. Yet it seems, during extra time of play, the EU and Britain finally settled on a deal, as announced on Christmas Eve by Boris Johnson and Ursula von der Leyen. However, the terms and conditions are still very shady, with the north of Ireland essentially being handed to the Republic of Ireland on a plate, hardliner Brexiteers reeling at Johnson, and indications suggesting that even the deal announced will have a huge negative impact on the British GDP. It seems that Brexit only ever spelt a lose-lose situation for Britain, who now find themselves alone and begging for business.
one of the most contentious issues surrounding Brexit was the hard border on the island of Ireland. Now, when we covered Brexit earlier this year, we spoke to former Sinn Féin Director of Publicity as to what he thought would happen. And it seems that in terms of a deal that was struck, well, some of the things that he did say appears to be right.
Of course, there are consequences for whatever direction the British government goes in and whatever it adopts. The European Union and lots of its foreign ministers strongly suspect that Johnson wants to bail out without a deal. And I have explained to your viewers the possible consequences of this in the north if the British government imposes a hard border again, because a hard border, of course, means customs posts being set up, then policemen to protect them, and then soldiers to protect the policemen. And that would be a return of the military presence in the north of Ireland. And that would be a recipe for disaster.
Okay. Mahan, to you. The north of Ireland, long been a topic of debate, obviously, in the UK.
Yeah.
Brexit, well, it has come and a deal has been set. But it ignited the Republican movement in Ireland, with many feeling that a united Ireland is actually closer than ever because of this Brexit. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
I think it's within touching distance. Brexit has been a key driver, obviously, and now this post-Brexit trade deal is even exacerbating the situation. But there's always been a groundswell for Irish unity. And for the first time ever, you can see connectivity between people in the Republic of Ireland, the political class, I mean, and the Republican movement in the north. They're kind of coming together, not seamlessly, obviously there's a lot of division between them. And for the first time in a couple of generations, the unionist movement in the north of Ireland is in real retreat. These are the pro-British people. And they've obviously dominated political life in Northern Ireland for time immemorial. But their grip is loosening. The UK is weaker as a result of Brexit. I mean, the real big issue here is Scottish independence, and that's going to happen very soon.
Well, the Brits are in trouble because the COVID-19, obviously, Atafa, has affected their economy so badly. Then we saw Brexit and what it did. We'll have to wait and see, obviously, post-Brexit, how it's going to affect the UK. And recently, we just saw the news that the 3,000 trucks that were unable to travel, the aerial shots of that was quite striking. Do you think that Brexit is going to bring more economic hardships for the UK?
Absolutely. The UK has to find new market and investors outside the European Union. Their traditional partners in the EU are not going to be as helpful as they used to be in 2021. The EU wants to make an example of the UK. They want to show the other members of the bloc that it's not going to be a good idea to leave the bloc and stand on your own. So I believe that there's going to be a lot of economic hardship because of this pandemic. The UK cannot make the connection it wants, and so it's going to pressure its citizens. There's going to be more austerities and more economic hardship in the future.
Okay, it's clear that some challenging times lie ahead for the UK, but let's now take a look back at our final topic of this show, the impact of sanctions.
In spite of the world dealing with the terrible effects of the COVID-19 virus, it seems that the year also saw an opportunity for some nations to abuse their power, imposing sanctions on other nations during the global pandemic. The Islamic Republic of Iran, for example, has been placed under sanctions by the US president following his withdrawal from the JCPOA upon taking office. With Iran seeing one of the worst initial rates of infection during the birth of the pandemic, sanctions meant that accessing vital medical supplies to treat patients and protect frontline workers became a challenge to deal with. On top of the virus, Iran labelled the sanctions as economic terrorism. However, it also proved that the maximum pressure policy on Iran failed to work, as Iran pushed on through to become self-sufficient. Further afield, the US also placed sanctions on the likes of Yemen and Syria, with the former entering what the United Nations called a humanitarian disaster, as famine, drought and lack of medical supplies meant that innocent victims were dying from a preventable cause, as well as being pounded by US-supplied weapons from the Saudi regime to the north. With Donald Trump as the key author of the sanctions facing a humiliating exit from the White House, what now remains to be seen is whether incoming Joe Biden may take a different view on sanctions and reverse the cruel acts committed by his predecessor.
Earlier in the year, we spoke to Kern Alexander, a professor of law, finance, and banking regulations from the University of Zurich in Switzerland. Let's remind ourselves as to what he said about sanctions.
Well, sanctions have historically been used by countries as instruments of foreign policy. And in countries, the effectiveness of sanctions depends really on the extent and influence of a country's economy. So the United States, of course, comes in for a lot of criticism for its use of economic sanctions because the U.S. economy is large and many countries want to trade with the U.S. But the downside of that is that when the U.S. wants to try to get its way in foreign policy, it will restrict access to its economy with other its trade relations with other countries, and that has a negative impact on diplomacy, and it has a negative impact also on certain groups in foreign countries.
Okay, let me turn to you first, Atif. Economic sanctions, obviously, it has been described by some. I'm looking at Iran's foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, who called it economic terrorism. So, and obviously Iran being a country that has suffered so much from these sanctions, they, as our guest even alluded to there, said it, ability for various countries to gain access to vital resources. It has restricted that, and medicine, humanitarian supplies or goods in general is one of the areas that has been restricted. Do you think that the U.S. has used sanctions to actually exert pressure on these countries?
Definitely. As it was mentioned on our interview, the United States always use this strategy to pressure certain countries, not just the U.S. Some of its Western allies use the same strategy. We saw examples in Iraq and Libya when these countries were under heavy sanctions by U.S. and some other countries like France and UK. And finally, what happened was that these countries were plunged into war and chaos. So that could be amount to economic terrorism, as Dr. Zarif said.
Yes, and Mahan, Iran has been a victim of that, and Trump obviously exercised what we have heard so much throughout his tenure, and that's the maximum pressure policy. At the same time, Iran has said that we've defeated that. Of course, it's been a hard road these past 4 years. Now, with Biden, news swirling that he may come back to the JCPOA, do you think that he's going to at least do what Iran has said for them will be a prerequisite, and that's a complete return and a complete lifting of the sanctions?
I think the important thing here, as the leadership here in Iran set out, our priority, our focus shouldn't be just to wait for the sanctions to be lifted. We don't know about the motivation of the other side. The priority here is to defeat the sanctions, more self-reliance, strengthening the economy. I personally believe that sanctions are not the root cause of our economic problems. There are a whole host of other issues that we can address locally.
Thanks again to both Mahan and to you, Atif, for your valuable contributions throughout this year. We obviously look forward to having you back next year, 2021, and see what you have to say in terms of the things that you share with us. Again, thanks for all of that. Well, that's all the time we have for this end of the year special on Economic Divide. And as we enter the year 2021, we look forward to bringing more of the stories that matter to you. So don't forget to get in touch with us. In the meantime, on behalf of the whole team here on Economic Divide, thanks for watching. Happy New Year, stay safe, and we'll see you again in January.